Now we're going to look at Egyptian architecture. As I mentioned recently, there was quite a good deal of painting that occurred. Every surface was generally covered with different sorts of hieroglyphics or storytelling. There was lots of different textures and carvings. Really, Egyptian architecture is extremely elaborate and a monumental size. So here in this sort of imagining of this structure, we really see how small the humans are in comparison to these gigantic columns. And that's not an exaggeration. That is really how big the that some of the temples are, like Karnak, which we're going to look at. Monumental architecture specifically, this is a scale of someone that I found on here, the spectrum of rustic to monumental buildings, by Dino. I'm not even going to try and say his last name. I should be able to say that, but I panic when I read names I'm not familiar with out loud. Here we are. So you can see here specifically what I like about this, and those of you who have taken other classes with me are going to enjoy this. I really like that there's a human figure involved, right? Because when we're talking about scale, you need to be able to wrap your mind around how big something is, and the only way to really do that consistently is to do that in relation to the human figure. We do this all the time because what we put on stage is in relation to the actor specifically. But here, the human is very large in comparison to what looks like slightly higher than normal door frame here for rustic. Rustic meaning essentially that it's just where you would live in your own house. And then it gets larger and larger: vernacular, low classical, high classical, and monumental. So here, this human is very small compared to a large and elaborately decorated structure behind him. What Dino is talking about here is, he says, the defining characteristic of monumental architecture is typically its public nature. The fact that the structure or space was built by lots of people for lots of people to look at or share in the use of, whether the labor was coerced or consensual. The concept of monumentality embraces a variety of structures in ancient Egypt, mainly ceremonial centers, temples, and tomb constructions. Monumental structures can express power as well as mask it. The task of building such a large and complex structure required a long-term commitment, as well as an ability to control resources and coordinate substantial investments of labor. These undertakings cannot have failed to create a sense of group identity or even distinct identities. For instance, between those who built and those who inhabited or used these structures. Such monuments embody not just the earth or stone from which they are built, but the people and experiences involved in their construction. They thus hold a special place in human memory and in individual or group identity. In Egypt, a large temple also owned sizable tracts of land and employed thousands of laymen to supply its needs. Temples were therefore key economic as well as religious centers. The priests who managed these powerful institutions wielded considerable influence. Despite their ostensible subordination to the king, they may have posed significant challenges to his authority. So one of the many in Egyptian building, it's a highly symbolic culture. We see this especially with all of the hieroglyphics and the fact that hieroglyphics really do communicate. I've seen some things online about how hieroglyphics are just like emojis and we've like moved back in time. That's ridiculous. Hieroglyphics actually had a really complex representation system, whereas emojis are meant to enhance a written language. But the use of symbols and the use of things in the environment in Egypt to enhance and deify was really unique. So specifically, let's look at these different botanical items. So we've got palm trees, which were all around them, papyrus, which was extremely useful not just for things like paper, but for all kinds of different domestic uses. And so here's sort of the papyrus stalk and its sort of feathery flower, for lack of a better word. We also have lilies, which are also called lotuses, depending on, if you're a botanical person, you can fight with the internet, because basically lilies and lotuses are used interchangeably. Specifically, there's the white lotus, which has this bud in the center, which is sort of represented in the shape of the pharaoh's crown that we were looking at earlier. But we also have the blue lilies and their bud. The lilies would open and close throughout the day, so they'd still be closed in the morning and slowly open, I think, throughout the day. And so the reason why lilies were considered to be sacred was that they would follow the passage of the sun, if you will, and the sun being the highest of the gods in the Egyptian structure. So, looking at those nature motifs, they carried these things and abstracted them. And that's what's brilliant about Egyptian culture, the way that they were able to abstract the natural. So here we have, and all of these columns were painted. We know that because there's still some paint attached to some of these artifacts. So we have this palm column capital here. This is the Temple of Isis from Philae. So here we have a sort of drawn and painted version of what the real version would have been. Here we have a papyrus. So again, I showed you those stalks, and then it's got this sort of fluffy, sort of flowery kind of thing. So that's what we're seeing here as a papyrus inverted bell capital. So you can see that it sort of, this is like what it means for bell. It's going sort of this sort of almost S-curve, but not quite that curvy. So here we have a palmette capital with an open and closed lotus at the base. So base of the column, base of the capital, not base of the column. So we have the closed lotuses here and the open lotuses here. And then we have this sort of palm leaf structure here. So this is a sort of combo of both of those. This is another combo of the same thing, it's just slightly different. So it would have been painted for these vertical lines here with the papyrus. And then down here we have these sort of lotus bud representations. This is another place to pause and sort of get in there and look at this. You can see these different motifs, the lotus bud, the lotus flower, the papyrus bud. All of these things were used over and over in different ways. We're going to see the top of this column here too, the bud capital. And of course those have representations in Upper Kingdom and Lower Kingdom. So the Upper Kingdom specifically had the white color, and we also know this from the crown I showed you, as well as the lotus and the lily being key to their the symbols, as well as the vulture. So Upper Kingdom is also the southern one. So we think of upper as being north, but because the Nile runs the opposite direction, then we would assume, because we are a top to bottom, left to right culture, the Nile actually runs north. And so Upper Kingdom is the southern part of the Nile. And so its colors are white. It's got lotus and lily and the vulture. The Lower Kingdom in the north specifically has the red color, papyrus as its vegetation symbol, and the cobra. So here we're going to look at a couple different kinds of column shafts. So these are fluted shape types. So there's just the straight up round version. There is also known as cylindrical. There's also the clustered, which has these different rounded intervals. polygonal, which we don't see quite as much as we will see later in in the Greek system. And then finally we have polyagonal. So here we have these sort of pointed arches that go around the capital and set on a wider base, circular base. So these are all different kinds of shafts. The thing about Egyptian architecture as well is because the sun, it was so bright and sunny most of the time, shadows are really important. So having that texture of shadows hitting the architecture was particularly important to the Egyptians. So every column, I'm going to go one ahead because this is the simpler one. Every column has a base, a shaft, a capital. This one's pretty worn off. An abacus, which is essentially a usually a square piece on top of the capital, and then the architrave, which is part of the structure. So the reason why we have columns is to support a roof usually, or some kind of open air roof, or maybe sometimes the open air would be covered by textiles in some way or shape or form. But the whole point is to create a post and a lintel, but the specific names for that are abacus and architrave. So going back a little bit, so here we have sort of a lotus bud capital. We have this sort of fluted shaft with convex channels. And then we have a base here, lotus motifs at the bottom. And then there's that abacus. So here on this next column over, we have the abacus, and we have this architrave beginning. So this would carry on over to another column. So it would create a portal, if you will. Hieroglyphics were on everything with stylized figures. And then here are some other, so this is a palm. It isn't labeled here really, but this is a palm style capital. We've got another lotus, another style of the lotus capital, and then another papyrus one. So here we have these sort of stalky bits, and so this is a pure papyrus one. So parts of the column, you're going to need to know parts of the column. Just memorize it. You will need that. Here we have another sort of closer look at the column supporting the architrave with the abacus here. These would have been highly decorated as well. You can see already the hieroglyphics on this, as well as the ornamentation on the cornice up here. So yeah, this all would have been painted. So here are these papyrus bud columns. They are holding up the architrave. So architrave, and this would have had another more in line and been architecturally structural to hold some kind of ceiling. This is called post and lintel. Post and lintel. So the difference here is these columns are more elaborate. The other item that you are no doubt are aware of is Stonehenge. That is post and lintel. So essentially, but it's monolithic post and lintel because each item is made of a solid piece of stone. So the Stonehenge, for example, it's all like one piece of stone laid on another piece of stone laid on another piece of stone, if that makes sense. So it's same structure every time. Really simply, you have something vertical, two things vertical at least, and then something going across it, post and lintel. So here's a photograph, a modern photograph of a more complete series of these architraves and columns. And this is where we start to call this a hypostyle hall. You'll get to see the word in a second. But what we're creating is a hall. We're creating a long, tall room, essentially. And it's called hypostyle when you do this. And you can see how dark this may have been. This will be fixed when we talk about Karnak, because they have a method for allowing the light to come in, called a clerestory window, which we will be using over and over and over in architecture for the future, because this is the basis, particularly when we get to Gothic But I think this is just a beautiful image, looking down this hallway and seeing this large carving behind this man sitting in this pool of light. I mean, this is theatrical. You could just put this piece of research on stage and it would make a really sweet set, right? The temple at Karnak was located near Thebes. Thebes is actually located underneath the modern city of Luxor. So here is what one of these giant, this is called the Great Hypostyle Hall, but these giant, I mean, the human figures are very small in comparison to this hall, and this is where we start to see these clerestory windows up above. So we have these papyrus bud columns, and then these concave, larger, open lotus style columns. And these sit higher than the lower columns on either side of the building. So this happens on both sides of the building, allowing them to create stone windows. Now, they wouldn't have had glass in them, but they just would have had opening slits at certain intervals, much like when we looked at the mud brick building earlier. It was a way to let light and air into this huge structure. And it would have looked really, really amazing. We have some computer-generated versions of this. So depending on time of day, now it might have not been making this beautiful shaft of light. But here you can see the scale of people against these really gigantic columns and the way that the light could have come into the room. These overly large doorways, which is really impressive. So when we talk about molding specifically, so I've pointed out a little bit of molding here, but there's two kinds. So there's the fillet. So you've got the wall and then another piece of wood on top of that, and then you would put something decorative between these 2 points. We still do this with molding. We do this all the time in theater when we're using wood, except for they're using stone. This is a cavetto piece of molding. It means concave. And an ovolo piece of molding, which it means convex. We also have a torus kind of molding. Essentially, all that means is you apply it flat right to the surface. So this is a example of the torus molding. So the torus molding is being applied directly to the wall itself, and the cavetto cornice here is that fillet, and you can even see the way that this is sort of sitting across the stone here, but it has got this concave shape to it. This also catches the light really well, creates a certain kind of shadow over the tops of buildings. This, of course, also would have had rich detail to it. So as you're looking at the hieroglyphs and you're seeing these vertical lines, all of this was emphasized by repetition, and it had a symbolic meaning as well. Here's some more of that cavetto cornice over the top of a wall. And you can see the way the shadow really cuts into the building. You can see it's almost dark inside. And then you have these sharp lines created by the molding. What cornice really does is it stops the eye. So you've got this monumental structure in front of you, and you're looking up and up and up, and it creates a finishing line on the top of the building. And this is what we do in theater as well, the tops of walls, especially when on stage we're not really putting a ceiling on something. It helps our eyes sort of stop, and it makes the wall look extremely finished. So this is where we get some of that. So here's, again, this is a place to pause and zoom in and look a little closer at these different moldings and cornices, because you will be seeing these patterns pop up again throughout history as there's revivals. They'll also take these moldings that were originally meant to be in stone and translate them to things like wood or plaster or other things like that. So a lot of what happens over time is there was an architectural reason for why something existed, but then it became a stylistic choice. I'd like to take a moment to talk about obelisks, because they are also something that's copied and used over and over throughout history. They are religious items that are found near palaces specifically. The obelisk symbolized the sun god Ra. And during the brief religious reformation of Akhenaten, which is the period I mentioned earlier where they broke all the stylistic rules, he was extremely unpopular by the time he died, though, and they destroyed a lot of his artwork that he created because it did not conform to the traditional norms. But he basically tried to make himself as close to the sun god Ra as possible. And he said that he was a purified ray himself of light. And so he built quite a few obelisks himself. It was thought that the god himself existed within the structure. The hieroglyphic inscriptions recorded the deeds and accomplishments of the pharaoh. The construction of the obelisk ensured the top of the obelisk would capture the rays of both the rising and the setting sun, thereby honoring Ra. Egyptian obelisks themselves were monolithic, which means they were hewn from a single stone and then moved to their intended destination. Other cultures frequently did not utilize the monolithic construction method. They would, cut. It's much easier to cut bits of stone and stack them, but it's not quite as durable as when it is one large continuous piece of stone. There is one called the Unfinished Obelisk. It was going to be the largest obelisk ever built. It would have been 120 feet tall, but it cracked while they were still cutting it out of the quarry. And this is near Karnak. So you can see here in the image where it sort of cracked right here. Can you imagine? So how they get this out of the stone as well is they take a rounded ball and they just chip away at it slowly. It's really kind of great. I'll show you a video that has to do with how they do that. I'm cutting the video down from something that's much longer. All right, briefly, I want to talk about, I've already mentioned that it's hard for us to really know what the palaces really looked like, as they were not created out of the same stone as the monuments and the tombs were. We have some evidence. We know where the palace complexes were. There's ways to know that, but the detail, they would sometimes take parts of palaces and move them somewhere else to a newly built palace. So really, when we talk about what we know about Egyptian culture, has more to do with their reverence for the afterlife rather than the way that their actual lives may have been lived. Here's an artist representation of an interior of a palace. Of course, the same themes would exist as far as painting, colorful painting on the interiors. You can see in this image, they have sort of reeds as a covering for the roof. That may have been possible. They could have also used textiles to drape over openings of the roof. There probably would have been statuary. There could have been plants in the interior. They may not have concentrated so much on things being rounded. So here you're seeing square columns that are a little bit more simple and more decorative because the actual living environment didn't necessarily have to have as much religious significance as the temples did. Here's some ornament. So again, we're seeing papyrus and lotus and different kinds of feathers or nature motifs that carry into the vertical lines that we're seeing in the columns on this decoration. Here's what I'm talking about with having sort of awnings or textiles hanging over to block the sun. It's a very hot climate, so of course as much as you can block the sun the better. But again, an easy way to get some color into the surroundings. Finally, I used chairs, much as my professor did when she taught this class, because chairs change throughout time and are influenced in the same way that architecture is by the past. So here we have a curule, which is a kind of stool that is going to be copied over and over throughout time. It has some simple armrests. It's more like a glorified stool. Over time, however, they did create chairs with arms, and in a lot of Egyptian art, you see a lot more like what I showed you in the Mesopotamian throne. There's the same sort of style that carried over because of trade influence. So you'll see some of those chairs in Egyptian art as well. But this one specifically is an armchair of Queen Hetepheres. So the time period is between 2575 and 2528 BCE. Many ornate armchairs made of wood with overlaid gold and silver found in the tombs of She and King Tutankhamun. These armchairs featured strong lines and exquisite detail, including carved lotus flowers and animal legs, much like what we saw in Mesopotamia. The discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922 took the world by storm, much as I showed you with Mesopotamia and the discovering of Queen Punami's tomb. And the echoes of ancient Egyptian chairs and ornamental motifs can be seen in the Art Deco furniture and decorative arts.